to all of you joining us today. At the outset, I want to just reiterate what Michael said earlier about submitting your questions. You can see sort of right below at the Q&A tab on Zoom, you can enter your questions and we will get to those at the relevant portion of today's session. To kick things off at the School of Labor and Urban Studies series on COVID capitalism, I am really thrilled to welcome our guest today, Professor Leo Panich. Leo is Canada Research Chair in Comparative Political Economy and Distinguished Research Professor of Political Science at York University in Toronto. He's the author of a number of books, including the classic Making of Global Capitalism, The Political Economy of American Empire, which he co-authored with Sam Gindin. More recently, he and Colin Lays co-authored Searching for Socialism, the project of the labor new left from Ben to Corbyn, a gripping account that is really indispensable for understanding what happened in the British election last year and what it means for the future of the Labour Party. Leo is also the longtime editor of the Socialist Register, an annual publication founded in the 60s by his mentor, Ralph Miliband, that each year continues to provide some of the most clear and incisive analyses of the political economy of our times. The 2021 volume, Beyond Digital Capitalism, will be published in the US by Monthly Review Press at the end of the year, and it'll be available online in the coming weeks. And I just want to say before diving in that Leo's work has deeply influenced how I think about capitalism, crisis, and the paths forward for those of us who hope to make a better world. And so I'm truly delighted to have him as our first guest and couldn't think of a better way to launch this important COVID capitalism series here at the School of Labor and Urban Studies. So Leo, welcome and thanks so much for joining us.
I'm really glad to be here, Samir. I think it's a terrific initiative that the school is undertaking, and I want to thank you and Michael and Gladys for putting this together.
Great. Well, to get started, we're here in now approaching mid-September, about 6 months since the pandemic formally hit the US and resulted in incredible amounts of preventable suffering and an economic crisis that's simply without precedent. The US, of course, has the highest number of cases and the highest number of deaths anywhere in the world. And while things have improved a little bit in certain parts of the country, like the Northeast, it continues to rage in much of the country, including the South and the Midwest. On the economic front, last week, another 880,000 people filed new unemployment claims. Prior to March, a number like that would have been simply jaw-dropping. Now it feels routine. As of the end of August, around 30 million people in the US were collecting unemployment, and the number of people who are actually out of work or underemployed is surely much higher than that. Meanwhile, the expanded unemployment program that was established in the early weeks of the crisis expired in mid-July, and Congress is yet to replace it. The executive order that Trump issued to provide some additional relief through FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, it's been slow to get going, and to date only 13 states are processing claims through it. And so all of this is to say that this has been an absolute nightmare on both the public health and the economic fronts. And it's easy enough to blame the Trump administration, to blame Congress, to blame many state governors around the country for what's going on. But I want to start by putting them aside for the moment. There's plenty of that on cable news and elsewhere. To begin, I want to start by talking about, beyond Trump and those around him, what can explain why this pandemic has been so devastating. And to do so, I think it may be helpful to start by placing the pandemic in a bit of historical context. The fact, for instance, that the US lacked the infrastructure to begin immediately producing and distributing sufficient quantities of PPE and testing kits, that our hospitals and nursing homes were thoroughly underprepared and so poorly equipped to handle the stress of the virus, that our public institutions are already bearing the burdens of acute fiscal stress, and that especially working people in this country, and especially working people of color, have for years been forced to live under intense economic insecurity. These are all symptoms of a larger structural crisis that didn't start with Trump, and they're not going to be resolved simply by Trump's leaving office. So to get us going, can you talk a little bit about where we were, say, in February 2020? What has happened over the past years and decades that can help to explain why this virus was so devastating in the US and especially for working people in the US?
Yeah, I think the operative word here is decades. And the short answer to that, especially given on the left, is neoliberalism. But I think most people don't really fully grasp what that word signifies. And I'm not sure myself that it's capacious enough to really get at the problem. Look, the problem goes back to 40, 50 years. To the time at which American corporations, which had been so central to the development and payment of a working class, which was a high wage working class, and which was able to secure for itself a privatized public health system, i.e. you got health benefits via your employer, et cetera. That began to unravel over the last 40, 50 years. And it also had massive effects in terms of the racial question in the United States, closing off opportunities for working class Black men in particular, who were much less likely to get jobs in a service economy. So one needs to understand this through the tendency inherent in capitalism for capitalists to want to expand their field of accumulation. And American corporations, very much aided by the American state, by the 1960s were investing very, very heavily abroad. They weren't mainly in search of cheap labor. Most of that investment was coming here to Canada or to Europe. It was trying to capture that mass market of well-paid workers abroad. That was facilitated, and it was crucially facilitated by the American state. And it began to have the effect of undermining the collective strength of American labor, American trade unions. And when they tried to exercise that strength through the course of the 1960s and 70s labor militancy, securing higher wages.
I think we've got a little glitch, but I'm sure it'll clear up in a sec. Sorry, I seem to have it seems that Leo's computer is having some issues, so I think let's give him 1 sec to come back. Of course, these events are incredible in that they allow us to include participants from all over the world. At times, though, there are certainly some technical difficulties associated with that. So let's see, I think Leo's computer is probably rebooting. In the meantime, we've got a question in the Q&A. The COVID-19 pandemic has had dire implications on workers generally. What can be done to comprehensively engender the rights of workers under the current epoch? That is a terrific question, and I think it's one that this entire discussion is going to be devoted to addressing. And the reason that we started the way that we did with sort of where things were prior to the pandemic is that it seems important to understand what some of the structural deficiencies of capitalism in this country and globally were as this thing hit. As Leo was noting, neoliberalism, a regime of privatization, of austerity, of deindustrialization and restructuring has prevailed over the last several decades, and it left the American working class, and in particular, working class communities of color in American cities and elsewhere, very, very vulnerable to a protracted crisis like this. And I believe that's probably what Leo was getting at. Seems we still don't have him back yet. Hopefully his internet restarts. Here he is. Leo, we lost you for a second. Are you back? And I think muted. Sorry about this, everyone. Just bear with us in one sec. I think Leo's muted, and there you are, Leo.
Sorry about that. My internet got cut off. It must be subterfuge, and that it's highway. It's probably one of the other internet companies who doesn't want me saying these things about transnational capital.
I think that's probably right, and I'm concerned about your forthcoming volume, "The Future of Digital Capitalism." I imagine. Well, you were
really sorry about that.
No worries at all. And you were talking about sort of neoliberalism and the ways in which that has undermined the capacities of the working class in this country to resist. And we had a question that we were discussing while you were cut out about simply, the catastrophic implications of this crisis on workers and what can be done to address some of those. So
that's what I was trying to come to. The parties of the working class, the Democratic Party, which was aligned with which American labor was aligned, but the social democratic parties in Europe supported the turn to neoliberalism and the multilateralization of capitalist corporations. They offered, the left-wing side of them at least offered, one thinks of Robert Reich, retraining of workers so they could compete with Chinese workers or Vietnamese workers earning $1 a day. And this proved, of course, to be completely unrealistic. Not least because Chinese and Vietnamese workers are also highly productive. They offered the working class credit, access to mortgages, especially the black working class that hadn't been available to them. And we're very proud of this. So income stagnated, workers increasingly relied on credit to sustain their standard of living. That blew up in 2008. The unions were unable to restore their strength in the face of all of this. And even though unemployment by the end of the Obama administration was beginning to go down, wages were not going up. Now, on top of all of that, of course, you had a tax revolt that the Democrats also bought into, and so did social democratic parties elsewhere, trying to compete with right-wing parties by offering less taxes. Most of the benefits went to those who paid the most. But the appeal to workers was also, well, you're not getting money in wages, we'll give you less taxes. And the result of that was that basic needs, goods that had been provided by the state, were increasingly undermined in the American case insofar as there was never public health care, and insofar as the Democratic administrations failed to install a single-payer public health system. It meant that workers were increasingly facing impoverishment should they face any major health expenditures. And they were increasingly unable to use their sole wealth, which was their home insofar as they had one, to borrow money in the wake of the crisis. So the situation just generally became much, much worse. And if you look at the New York Times today, Nicholas Kristof has a remarkable piece on a social progress index that was started in 2011, which measures the real wealth of a society in terms of nutrition, longevity, education, health, etc. And the United States is only one of 3 countries since 2011 who has gone down on the index, the other 2 being Hungary and Brazil. And the United States has gone down more than the United States or Brazil. So all of that needs to be combined with the lack of planning capacity in the American state, the rejection of it for a very, very long time, the meeting of public needs through private enterprise. And I've often given this example. Back in 2006, the Department of Health set up a research and development authority, which in the wake of SARS and the other viruses that had emerged by that point, was targeted with the responsibility of increasing the national stockpile of ventilators. It wasn't until the Obama administration in 2010 that a search for contracts based on bidding coming from private corporations was undertaken. One was signed in 2012 with a Japanese firm based in California, a small firm, to provide ventilators at $3,000 each. The market price for ventilators was $10,000. That firm was taken over a year later by a larger medical production company in order to shut down that contract because they would have been underselling by $7,000 what they were selling it for. And then that firm, after it closed that contract, was taken over by an even larger medical production firm for $50 billion. The result of that is that it was only last year in 2019 that the FDA issued a new contract to produce ventilators by 2020. And that was only for 10,000 ventilators, not the 40,000 that had originally been planned for. This is just one example of the lack of planning capacity being so caught up in the problem of competitiveness in a capitalist system. It's not that the attempt isn't made, it's not even that money isn't spent. It is that the lack of coordination because of the chaos of capitalist competitiveness means that that capacity is not there. And I have to tell you, although it's been most terrible in the States, that lack of capacity has been visible in most other advanced capitalist states as well.
Right. And this lack of planning capacity, which again, as you noted, is particularly profound in the United States, has been a feature of neoliberalism around the world over the last several decades, as you note, and culminated, in a sense, financially at least, as you note, in 2008. I want to use that to get to this, the specificity of this current economic crisis. So you talk about 2008, of course, a catastrophic event that from which many working people never recovered. Yet this crisis that we're in now is exceptional in certain ways. And I'm wondering if you could spell out the ways in which the current COVID-related economic crisis is unique, perhaps in comparison to 2008 or even the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Yeah, and it is different. The previous crises within the framework of globalization were a product of the way in which states had signed agreements to remove capital controls, to promote the free flow of capital, to treat foreign capital the same as domestic capital. That's mostly what free trade agreements are about. They weren't about reducing tariffs. That mostly had taken place, except in the case of China, through the long post-war process before the WTO was established. And most of the financial crises were a product of the hot movement of capital around the world in the financialized capitalism that accompanied globalization. That's what produced the 2008 crisis. It was the banking crisis actually began in Europe, even with German banks, and they're generally seen as social democratic and stable, having so heavily invested in the American mortgage industry. Most of black housing in the black areas of Cleveland was underwritten by Deutsche Bank. So that was at the center of the empire. That was a massive crisis, but it was one of some 70 financial crises that financialized globalization had produced. This crisis is very different. This is a crisis in production. And it's a crisis that does not emerge out of a sudden profitability crisis, even though profits have been relatively low. It doesn't emerge out of the enormous debts of American corporations who have borrowed very, very heavily in corporate bonds, often in order to use that money to buy back stock, to enrich their managers, etc. It actually is a crisis that comes out of the state's response to a pandemic. The state closes down production. Not only the production of goods, but production of services. And in that context, of course, finance then seizes up. And the crisis would be much, much worse had the banking system, as happened in the early 1930s, seized up. So, this is a different crisis. What the American state became good at, even as it lost so much capacity in other respects during the course of the previous crises, was containing financial crises. And the Federal Reserve and the Treasury developed enormous expertise. They said very openly, we can no longer prevent financial crises. The system is out of control in that sense. All of the innovation occurs because of it in the financial sector. What we can do, what we want to do, what we're good at, is containing crises. And they proved that to be the case, even in 2008-9. And the first response of the American state, the effective one in March 2020, was for the Federal Reserve to play that role again. Because it was a crisis in production, it had to do it in a much bigger way than it ever did. And for the first time, the Federal Reserve actually bought private corporate debt, because the scale of the funds that were out there would lead to a collapse of the corporate debt system and the collapse of those corporations, a bankruptcy, as lenders tried to get out of those bonds. It also lent directly to municipalities for the first time in American history, right? And above all, it played the large international role it's always played as the world central bank. It provided dollars to central banks around the world. Because whenever a crisis happens, world's capital runs for dollars. It runs for the safe currency, which is backed by the American Treasury bill. And the Federal Reserve acted first in mid-March. It took a while for Congress to act. And then it's true, it has to say that they acted with the largest fiscal stimulus in American history by far. And although, of course, as with the financial system, what the Fed does is it bails out the banking system in order to keep it going, right? Similarly, the CARES Act was designed to bail out corporations. Large businesses, inevitably much more than small ones, through the payment protection program, et cetera. But the provision of $600 a week on top of unemployment insurance at the state level was something unheard of, not only in American history, but almost anywhere. And that's even apart from the check that Trump wrote to everybody for $1,200 and signed his name to. So you see, this is something of an entirely different order, both in terms of the cause of the crisis and of the state's response to it.
And I want to dig in a little bit here on these 2 points about the Federal Reserve and about Congress. As you note, of course, that the CARES Act stimulus of $600 a week in unemployment provision on top of the baseline, which is paltry, of course, in the United States, was the largest fiscal stimulus in U.S. history. It did tide a number of millions of people over for the first months of this crisis. However, it expired on July 31st. At the same time, there's this interesting dynamic here that you're describing with the Federal Reserve. In contrast to 1929, 1930, 1931, the Federal Reserve has learned, along with the Treasury and central banks elsewhere around the world, how to respond to crises to stabilize capitalism. In some ways, there's something ironic about this, I guess I should say, that the democratic processes through the legislature have been so paralyzed, yet the technocratic processes through the central banks have been efficient, not without contradictions, which you might spell out, but efficient. What does this say in your mind about the state of economic policy making in the US and the world today, and about the prospect of true democratization in the response?
Well, it is indeed ironic. The Trump administration, which came, Trump got elected by appealing to American workers directly as workers, as a working class. He used the word working class. He's doing it again in this campaign. And the Democrats kept talking about the middle class. And he appealed to them precisely in terms of them having been screwed by the free trade agreements, above all by NAFTA, but in general by globalization. Once he got in, he reduced the capacity of the American state in all kinds of arenas. I mean, not only attacking Obamacare, but undermining the Center for Disease Control, undermining the EPA, running down the capacity of the State Department and of the Treasury. The one institution which managed to retain its capacity under the Trump administration was the Federal Reserve. And that's despite various attempts he made to appoint all kinds of crazies to federal board, etc. The reason for this is, ironically, what the left criticized so much about central banks, which was that during this process of neoliberal globalization, they asserted their independence. And part of the role of the American Treasury and Federal Reserve and the IMF and the World Bank was to insist that other central banks assert their independence. What did that mean? That meant their independence from elected governments. That they would follow policies in monetary policy which were not under pressure from elected governments to meet the basic welfare needs of their citizens. Not to engage in having large fiscal deficits, etc. To give the priority to paying off the investors if there's a deficit when you raise taxes, and not to give money to welfare recipients, right? But the independence of the central banks, especially the Federal Reserve under the Trump administration, which has so denigrated even further American state capacity, is that the Fed did not lose its capacity. So in terms of its remarkable ability to act as the world central bank, coordinating the containment of crises, its remarkable ability to keep the banking system going, right? And imagine what would have happened if it had collapsed, right? Yes, the irony is that independent central banking, no, that isn't necessarily a good thing. I do think that they have a high degree of autonomy. Federal Reserve Chair Powell, who is no lefty, is constantly making the case that we need fiscal stimulus. He is not at all happy that the HEROES Act passed by Congress by the House as the successor to the CARES Act has not in fact gone through due to Republican intransigence, etc. And he's made that very clear. But it does show the danger of progressives being dependent on independent central banks to make that case.
And building off of that, you're talking about the emphasis on central bank independence, the leadership, the Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank has shown globally the ways in which other central banks have modeled themselves off of the Federal Reserve. All of this is an expression of what you and your co-author Sam Gindin have described as the central role of the US state, the US federal government in what you call superintending global capitalism. This is a role that the US has played at least since the end of World War II. It's a role that has not been without consequence for working people in the United States. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what that role has looked like, and you've done a little bit of this, but what that role has looked like over the last few decades, how you might see that changing, if at all, through the pandemic, and what all of this means for workers. What are, let's say, to put another way, the class politics of U.S. leadership in stabilizing global capitalism?
A central thesis of that book was that the main cleavages in global capitalism are not so much between states as within them. And what we meant by that was that it's the balance of class forces within nation states that allows various nation states to play the role that they do in superintending global capitalism, managing their domestic economies with an eye to reproducing the global capitalist economy. Trump got elected as a result of the class cleavages inside the United States, increasingly represented through racism and xenophobia, insofar as the American labor movement had lost its capacity, if it ever had it, to organize effectively new sectors of the economy, and to build links between the providers of services and the clients of services, to educate people on how capitalism works as a system, and why it's necessary to struggle against it. In that context, you got an administration as a product of the class developments inside the United States, which was anti-globalization in its ideological orientation. Insofar as it still represents an American capitalist class which is so heavily invested around the world, American multinational corporations which still dominate almost every sector in global capital, including, ironically, even in healthcare, where America's private healthcare providers are the leading international corporations. That administration has not gone very far in actually undoing global capitalism. NAFTA hasn't been changed very much. A recent survey of 200 leading American corporations shows that only 4% of them had any plans to relocate production from China back to the United States. Very little has happened in that respect. But in terms of the political role of the American state, apart from the role of the Federal Reserve in coordinating the containment of crises, the political role of the United States has been very far from an effective one in superintending. On the contrary, it has sabotaged that, even in capitalist terms. So, the G7, the G20, the larger group of capitalist states, which includes China and Brazil and South Africa and so on, they signed an agreement during the 2008 crisis, brought to Washington by Bush, before Obama, in which they pledged not to introduce tariff measures or capital controls in the face of what appeared to be the greatest crisis since the Depression, which all states did during the Depression. And they pledged not to do that. Trump's behavior has been to diss the G7 and the G20 to their chagrin and amazement. And that has meant that the administration of global capitalism is at odds and ends. His pulling out of the WHO in the middle of the pandemic, which won't come into effect until next year, but nevertheless, ideologically, that has an enormous effect. In that sense, the Trump administration is playing a role politically that is undermining global capitalism. What has happened is that the economic crisis of global capitalism morphed by 2016 into a political crisis of global capitalism because of what happened at the political center of global capitalism. And we'll have to now see what happens if Trump does manage to get replaced by Biden. And I have to say that watching the Democratic convention, I found it hard to believe that workers would think that Biden was very credible in saying he would protect their jobs, given it was 3 decades of Democratic administrations which underwrote what I was describing at the beginning of this talk. Today, Biden's suggestion that he would introduce a 30% corporate tax on any profits made on goods produced abroad that are then re-imported to be sold to American workers at home is an indication that they are now scrambling to try to develop policies that will protect American workers. But at the same time, of course, their commitment will be to play a functional role in the revival of the G7 and the G20 generally. So these contradictions are not going to go away. Of course, the domestic contradictions, even if Biden's elected, with what his racism and xenophobia has encouraged. The way it's encouraged the militias, the way it's encouraged local police forces to ignore local mayors and councils. That won't go away. So the instability, people look to is China challenging the United States, almost in a mirror image of Trump. The real problem with globalization lies in the domestic balance of class forces in the United States and in other countries.
Right, and as you know, just in closing, that those contradictions domestically, the political rot, such as it is within different states, is not unique to the United States. The rise of right-wing nationalist governments has been a trend, certainly over the last decade. And it's interesting to note that some of the countries that have fared the most poorly through this pandemic are ones that are led by such right-wing nationalist governments. In addition to the United States, Brazil, India, the UK, and elsewhere. And so just moving away from the US for a moment, I want to get your take on how this is playing out globally. We saw in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, and indeed in the aftermath of every financial crisis in the recent history of capitalism, the way public officials, central bankers, the financial sector imposed brutal austerity as a way to force states to fix what they characterized as profligate budget deficits. Greece, for instance, is never recovered from the painful austerity imposed upon them during the crisis a decade ago. Outside of Europe, in the global south, the confluence of such massive health and economic crises has the potential to result in severe humanitarian crises as well. Just a few days ago, the UN warned of the risk of COVID-related famines and building on a pre-existing famines in Yemen, in different parts of Africa. And unfortunately, I suspect that this is just the beginning of such humanitarian crises. We don't have the time here to cover the entire world, but perhaps in some broad brushstrokes, you could describe what you see as some of the key features of this crisis globally, and what your assessment is of the international response, perhaps in relation to Trump or in relation to some of the more enlightened, let's say, fractions of the capitalist class elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, this is something that's extremely worrying. And it's reinforced by the vaccine nationalism that we're seeing. Even the Trudeau government here in Canada, which I know you Americans think if Trump's reelected, you're all going to try to come here, or at least all you progressive ones. I keep saying we're going to build a wall and make you pay for it. But the Trudeau government just in the last weeks has signed deals with private pharmaceutical companies to get first dibs on any vaccine that they produce, and they will have to pay them the millions of dollars that they've done this deal with, whether they manage to produce a successful vaccine or not. Trudeau explained this in terms of all the states who can do this, who have the funds to do this. Being engaged in this type of vaccine nationalism, which entirely undermines precisely the type of program that the World Health Organization was trying to develop, whereby the rich countries would pay into a fund to provide a general vaccine program globally, out of which they get their vaccines, but then so would the third world countries or the global south countries who couldn't afford to pay for this. The situation is made much worse, of course, by so many large capitalist funds having piled into corporate debt as well as state debt in the global south. Insofar as they were getting very low rates of return under quantitative easing from buying treasury bills, they were, of course, and they need to do this in order to meet their retirement needs of the doctors and lawyers who put their money into these hedge funds, or if they're institutional pension funds, to meet their legal obligations in terms of meeting the pension funds of, teachers here in Toronto. They therefore were buying a lot of third world debt now. Once the crisis hit, with the enormous implications it would have for countries in the global south, money started flowing out of those bonds. And part of what the Fed was doing, part of what the IMF has done, even the American Treasury has done with the G7, and is that they have undertaken a postponement of many of those countries having to repay bilateral debt, insofar it was a public debt. But they could only do, if insofar it was private, they could only say to the private capitalists that you should be doing the same, and they haven't. Only Argentina so far has managed to secure a restructuring of its debt, 65 billion. But the rest, everything's in limbo. Now, the danger of that was somewhat reduced by what the Fed did. And therefore financial markets, you see it above all in the American stock market, but you also see it in bond markets, which have recovered in this context. So my hope is that because every state will increase its fiscal deficits massively, as Japan has done since 1990, because it never got out of the crisis of Japanese capitalism after the late 1980s, that it'll be much more difficult for financial capital to attempt to discipline states by playing one off against the other, by playing the small difference in interest rates as a means of leveraging them to cut back on their social expenditure. We'll have to see. And, the European Union has now talked about, they haven't really instituted it yet, in introducing a EU bond.
Right.
And they are saying that they won't impose austerity conditions on the countries that money from that bond is dispersed to. But that is still very highly contested inside Europe. The bond program has not gotten off the ground in any serious way. Even there, in other words, you see the continuation of the extent to which it is selfish behavior on the part of ruling classes in nation states, even in the most advanced of the areas where you have multinational state institutions, right? Where is really the center of gravity. And because this is a labor studies program, I just have to end by saying, in identifying this problem in Europe, Samir, one needs to identify the failure of the labor movements in Germany, in Sweden, in France, in Norway, to come to the aid of workers in Greece and Spain and Portugal. In that sense, who is really responsible? We expect capitalists to do what they do. The fact that the strong labor movements of Northern Europe displayed racist attitudes vis-a-vis the so-called lazy workers in Southern Europe, even though they work way more hours than Northern European workers do, is part of the problem. And if we're going to come out of this in a progressive way, it's going to have to mean a shift in the balance of class forces of a kind that also reflects that inside each country.
And so to build off of that and transition into the audience Q&A portion, I want to ask, in closing, of course, there's no shortage of bleakness around. There's a lot. This is a very dark, every aspect of what you've described, every aspect of what may be coming, insofar as some observers have noted, this may be a preview of the kinds of crises that climate change creates: social, political instability, economic disruption, natural world disasters. All that said, there have been some glimmers of hope for a new world, let's say, being born out of the ashes of the old, to borrow from the labor anthem Solidarity Forever. In the US this summer, we saw incredible insurgencies against racist police violence, against economic inequality, that merged questions of racial injustice with economic inequality, austerity, public spending priorities. And it's possible, though by no means guaranteed, that this will develop into a broad-based social struggle against the barbarism, for lack of a better word, of the existing order. So to close, and before we transition into the audience, can you talk a little bit about what you see as some of the new opportunities or terrains for social struggle that might emerge out of this nightmare we're living in?
Yes, I should first of all say that ideologically, I think neoliberalism is really in trouble. It was never nearly the hegemonic ideology that everybody assumed was buying into it. You could see that from the anti-globalization movement from Seattle on, that it wasn't as powerful a hegemony as many thought. But what is important here is the social democratic line that the New York Times is taking on what is required by way of the decline in the standard of living and the more general living conditions in the United States. And that is reflected in, I think, establishment media around the world. And that's not unimportant. That is not unimportant. We need to remember that the New Deal was a class compromise. And Roosevelt, how often he was called a rapacious socialist by his capitalist enemies, he was very much conscious that he was saving capitalism. And so I think this is not unimportant. When Boris Johnson goes on television, Boris Johnson, and says there is such a thing as society, he's directly speaking to the ghost of Margaret Thatcher in number 10 Downing Street.
Right.
Because her phrase was, there is no such thing as society. There are only individuals and their families. So this is not unimportant, and it gives us an opportunity. That said, the nature of the Democratic Party, the nature of the Labour Party in Britain, the nature of social democracy in Europe is such that they have embraced the logic of a global capitalism. And that means that they themselves are caught up in the contradictions and chaos of it without being able to break from it, as was evident by what happened to Corbyn, which was a product of the majority of Labour MPs being determined that he not become prime minister. And similarly, we always knew that Bernie's chances of getting elected were at best 40%, but the chances of getting the nomination were, less than that. So, I do think that the shift ideologically matters, but what really is going to matter is that the development of socialist aspirations and beliefs on the part of a new generation, reflected in the DSA and Momentum, and one hopes in a significant portion of Black Lives Matter, that will have reverberations of the kind it did in the teachers' union strikes. After 2016, many of the people who led them were inspired by Bernie's campaign in 2016. One has to hope that that will now reverberate to changing institutions in American society at the base. Above all, reviving the American labor movement. What is to be hoped is that the activists who were mobilized behind Sanders will become active not only in the street demonstrations, very important that that continue, but will become organizers of a working class which has been fragmented, miseducated, isolated, lumpenized in many ways. That is what people need to turn their attention to. We need to turn to a new process of class formation of the kind that produced the unions and the mass left parties at the beginning of the 20th century.
I think that's a wonderful way to round out this part of the discussion, Leo. Thank you so much. And now moving to the audience questions. I've got a few here that I'm going to sort of maybe group together and package because there's some common themes.
And Samir, may I jump in for one?
Oh, please do, Michael.
Thank you both for that. Just for our attendees, please continue to submit your questions. We'll take them on an ongoing basis. Also, we want to offer an opportunity to all attendees to ask their questions on screen live to Samir and Leo. So we're going to enable the raised hand function. So you'll see a button that says raise hand. Click that button if you want to ask your question live and on screen. Thank you. And Samir, yeah, please go ahead with the questions that have already been submitted.
Great. Okay, I'll start with one that's here. So the first one I'm seeing is raising the question of how migrations are likely going forward to affect the conditions of work in advanced capitalist countries, the balance of class forces, the politics of it within, as you described, different states. Of course, the politics of immigration have been with us for some time, and Trump has done much to exploit in the nastiest and most vitriolic ways. As climate change continues to destabilize parts of the world, we are likely to see more migration between states and within states. And so can you talk a little bit about this and perhaps generally about the larger climactic crisis of capitalism, of which it may be a part in the years to come?
Yeah, this is a tremendous question, and it's right to raise it. Had we had more time, I would have. I think one first has to say, with the fires that have taken place in the last few days in the Moria refugee camp in Lesbos, Greece, Americans need to be reminded of how global a problem this is. This is not simply a matter of Trump and his build the wall and his xenophobia. In Europe, which is still pointed to by Bernie and others on the American left as their model, Bernie's Denmark, the reaction to the migration crisis is reactionary. It is not progressive. And what we're seeing is a crisis that in some ways I think is as imminent as is the global climate crisis in terms of its effects on humanity globally. And one has to say part of this is a product of people being expelled from countries in the global south by virtue of gang wars or real wars. But part of it is still the pull of northern labor markets, which want to take advantage of cheap labor at home. So part of the restructuring that went on in the United States was about bringing in Central American workers into, chicken factories to compete with black workers in chicken factories. Neither of them unionized, neither of them knowing what the others were being paid, producing conflict among them. It isn't just a humanitarian crisis, it feeds directly into a material crisis That's reflected in what we were talking about in the working classes in question. And the resolution of it is only going to be coming through the development of class solidarities that transcend this in the way that I was trying to get at towards the end of my talk. One can say, in this time, except that yes, the migration crisis is absolutely central, and it's a long-term one, which isn't going to go away with the recovery that will eventually come from this pandemic, although it will be a while to come. It's very clear. It's not going to be resolved quickly. There isn't going to be any V-shaped recovery. But that crisis will continue, as will the climate crisis, which is all the more reason why we need to be, making the case for economic and social planning and cooperation in international trade, cooperation in the control over capital flows around the country, around the world, and cooperation in providing supports for migrants, or in providing the kinds of funds that would allow for conditions to be changed in their own countries. That's the agenda for us. It's as difficult to imagine a short-run solution to this as it is to imagine a short-run solution to the climate crisis. So I think one has to say, here's the central strategic contradiction. If we keep saying we've only got 5 years left before the climate crisis, can no longer be resolved, we can't solve it. We are engaged in a long-term strategic struggle to rebuild the capacities of the social forces that would be able to finally address it. And it may be that when they finally are in a position to address it, they'll be facing a much greater crisis at that time than it is today or is projected to be in 2030. And that applies both to the migration crisis and to the climate crisis. I wish I could give a happier answer than that, but I don't think there is one.
Right. I think we have a guest, Trey, who's going to appear on screen to ask the next question.
Hello, I'm Trey. I'm a ICU nurse, originally based in Brooklyn, New York. I'm also a revolutionary socialist, and I write and edit for Left Voice, which is part of La Izquierda Diario. I think we've done a few interviews or an interview with you in the past, Professor Panitch. So there's a bunch of things that I wanted to hear you speak a little more about, particularly the question of how imperialist politics and policies, particularly the brutality towards the global South, has so much to do with, or is actually primarily to do with, the balance of class forces and class struggle internally. I totally agree with that. And I can see too, with the pandemic in New York City, when we were on the front lines and we did not have even the basic gear to care for our patients and to protect ourselves. I think dozens of us nurses just in New York City have died from COVID. We have over 100 transit workers in New York City die unnecessarily. The thing that I guess I want to hear you talk more about, you mentioned the Bernie Sanders campaign and kind of in parallel Corbyn's campaign and deeply undemocratic. Well, we have an undemocratic two-party system where both parties are capitalist parties. And the problem we have now, we have 2 months or even less before an election where it's all about getting Trump out and seeing, I guess, what maybe you would see as a short-run problem and a short-run solution to a much deeper problem. And what I think in the left, even in the United States, is the possibility of, or the urgent need for political independence as working class. We don't have a tradition. We don't have a Labor Party in the US. That's an important difference with Corbyn or really any other developed country, and even in the global South. I'm in Argentina right now, and there's a Trotskyist electoral front that runs independently from any capitalist party, and they're given, you know, space on TV to talk about a socialist platform. So I see a problem of even having that conversation, especially right now with Trump being, of course, the monster and the administration, the xenophobic administration we've dealt with. So how do we start, you know, talking to each other as a working class, as people from oppressed sectors of the working class, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is now being pushed and you know, pressured into that same channeling institutional solution. And I think, you know, in the pandemic, just to end it here, sorry, in the pandemic, when we were on the front line, it was about single payer up until then. And even single payer seemed really radical to a lot of my coworkers, or kind of abstract. But in that moment where we weren't getting gloves, gowns, we didn't have wipes or ventilators, suddenly the idea of a nationalized industry, of getting rid of bosses, that they had nothing to do with it, that they had no solution to our problems, became really concrete. And then we started talking about, well, we don't want to nationalize under Trump, right? We don't want to further empower this guy. So then it has to be under worker control. So planned economy, I mean, that's a worker state. And we need a revolution. It's not going to happen even through electing Bernie. It's not going to be an incremental step-by-step reform after reform. And I think that there's a major problem within even the left in the United States, and with the majority of the leadership of the DSA, who kind of falls into this trap of, you know, we can make it look like the Nordic countries, who are now in this national vaccine drive. So I just want to hear a little bit about your thoughts on that kind of political impasse that we're facing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that, and what you said about the conditions in the hospitals of you and the other workers and the cleaners in them, etc., was so graphic and so important. I think the left has to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. The short-term concern with getting Biden elected is a very, very valid one, because the grave danger with a Trump administration renewed, and of course he may not go even if he's defeated, and then the struggle over that will have to continue, is that an authoritarian capitalist state, especially Trump with his base in the militias, the local police forces, the bike gangs, will close political space. And the closure of political space is what we cannot now stand, precisely because of the potential that you're pointing to with groups like yours, and the way in which your co-workers were responding positively to a socialist message. We need space to build on that. So this is a moment not dissimilar to the early 30s, where it is very important that with regard to the maintaining of liberal democratic political space, we do have a popular front. At the same time, and it was unlike the case, I think, with a good many Social Democratic Party leaders, we cannot allow ourselves to be silenced as socialists as we join in that common struggle to maintain liberal democratic space, to get Trump defeated. And I don't think that's impossible. I think one can continue to make the socialist case, and it can go quite far. Moreover, I think the space is necessary in order to do the organizing that we need to do. And one has to hope that at least out of this administration, given what's happened, and given how, even the most hard-bitten Democratic career politician is bound to see the terrible effects of having abandoned the working class in so many communities where they got elected. They could have, run anybody, Mickey Mouse, for dog catcher in certain places since the Great Depression, and get them elected. And then in 2016, they lost that. Well, their minds get concentrated by that, career politicians. So I think we may finally see the labor legislation that was promised back in 1992 by the Democrats and never implemented, especially if the outcome of this election is that both the Senate and the House are taken by the Democrats. I think even without a major realignment internally in the Democratic Party, we may see that labor legislation passed, and that will create space for changing the labor movement, not just for bringing in new members with a checkoff, but changing the labor movement. Now, I think you're absolutely right to say that one needs to make the socialist case, and these guys aren't going to do it. But that's a long run struggle. And I have to say, Trey, I disagree with you that a insurrectionary strategy is viable. Only very particular conditions, as Gramsci pointed out, immediately after the Russian Revolution allowed the Bolshevik Revolution to happen. And I just don't think that a insurrection is possible. Even apart from the costs that are entailed in that type of a revolution. So I do think we need to find a way to get over this false divorce strategically between reform and revolution. We need to have revolutionary reforms in the sense of the types of reforms that change the institutions of the state, and the demand regarding the police that is coming out of Black Lives Matter reflects an awareness that it isn't just enough to change policy. It's necessary to change the institutional apparatus of the state. And that applies not only to the repressive apparatus, it applies to the social welfare apparatus. So, I think where I would disagree with you is to imagine that this isn't a long-run, slow struggle that is going to involve reforms, but not reformism of the kind that led social democracy into the embrace of capitalism through the 20th century.
Thanks, Leo. That is and thank you, Trey, for that really thought-provoking question. Building off of that, and this will be our last one. We've got one here that I think it relates well, and it's a nice note to close on. Marty asks, you said revise or reform the labor movement, perhaps through labor legislation passing, resulting in a renewal of the movement beyond just, as you said, checkoff. Can you just maybe talk for a minute about what a reinvigorated dynamic labor movement might look like and could try to accomplish in the world that COVID is making?
Well, I mean, we have to look at the concrete examples. We have to, as Jane McAlevey keeps on writing, we have to take our model from the type of wall-to-wall organizing that the CIO began with in the 1930s as against craft unionism. To go to what Trey was speaking of, it involves having hospital workers unions that include everybody from the ICU nurse to the woman who's cooking the meal in the hospital basement. And we have to go into arenas of organizing which are, ripe for it. You think of the Amazon warehouses and the struggles being undertaken by Amazon workers who are as essential to the logistics of keeping the economy going as are public sector workers. And it makes the case for Amazon to become a public utility. Far from the post office being privatized, Amazon is one of now the largest and most strategically important corporations in the world, needs to be brought into the public sector. But part of the campaign for that will depend on organizing Amazon workers. So there's that, but there's much more than that, because we have seen that trade unions securing legal protections for collective bargaining have been incorporated into a legalized labor management relationship under the aegis of capitalist corporations and a capitalist state. In the American case, and it's not unique, this has always been there historically in some American unions and international ones. You imagine the auto workers becoming a corrupt union. I mean, one could criticize Walter Reuther for becoming bureaucratized, undermining the militant left in the union during the Cold War, et cetera, et cetera. But to see the UAW corruption at the leadership level is a reflection of what needs to be transformed. But beyond that, Marx and Engels used to think that unions would be schools for socialism, although not agencies for socialism. Well, they need to become schools for education of the working class. They need, once again, to become centers of working class life, as they often were in the Depression. You would go to a local labor council. There'd be a pool hall there. It would be a place to hang out. It did some of the things that food banks are now doing, that workers' action centers are doing for non-unionized workers. That is the kind of image we need to have. But it's going to involve organizers of the type that organized them in the first place, not staffers paid at 70, 80, 90,000, 100,000 a year, although I'm not saying they should be exploited, but people who are prepared to be sleeping on floors or in attics, moving around the country, embedding themselves in working class life as organizers again. It is going to take that. And if it does happen, I think that there's no reason to think we will replicate the type of unions that ended up being agencies for securing enough wages to allow workers to be no more than consumers, at best, in a capitalist society.
Leo, I think that is a great note to wrap on. This discussion has been incredibly fruitful and enriching. I think we've covered the scale of the crisis, the challenges, the origins of the crisis, which certainly predate this particular microbe or virus, and the possibilities for real change. I mean, this is certainly the most challenging time in recent memory, politically, economically, but it's also a time, as we saw this summer, and as Leo's describing, and as I think, as Trey alludes to, an opportunity to create a new world. And I hope this discussion contributes to that effort, and the subsequent events in the COVID Capitalism series, most immediately on October 1st, when we dive in with Saket Sani and Sean Sweeney on the climate crisis and the need for a resilience workforce at noon on October 1st. So with that, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Thanks for these incredibly thought-provoking questions. Thank you, Trey, for appearing on screen with us. And above all, thank you, Leo, for making the time to have this conversation with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Samir.